Okay, folks, I'm trying this. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed for this video because I have no space left on my computer. And you've seen my videos in the past. I've had technical problems with the computer freaking out and freezing and slowing down my voice and everything. Doing a video today because I felt I had to. Subject matter, Rudy Van Gelder, who passed away yesterday. And I was thinking, if I only did videos every time some major creative jazz or whatever type of music artist passed away lately, I would still be doing videos at least twice a week, it seems. Last week, Bobby Hutcherson died. I discovered it when I turned on the radio. Oddly enough, I usually listen to CDs in the car, but I put on WKCR, which is I think it's Columbia University in New York, non-commercial radio station, which plays mostly jazz, classical, and avant-garde music. Announced that Bobby Hutcherson had passed away. They preempted all their programming and featured at least 24 hours. It might have been a bit more. It might have been like 28 hours of nothing but Bobby Hutcherson's music and talking about his life. And it was really nice to hear. The first thing I heard on the radio that was a Bobby Hutcherson thing was this, I thought it was Cal Jader before I realized it was Bobby Hutcherson. And before I had heard that he'd passed away. Turned on the radio, put on WKCR in New York City, heard this wonderful Cal Jader Latin jazz type piece that turned out to be Bobby Hutcherson, which I realized I think they played the whole album. And as it turns out, it was an album I had, which it was like, oh my God, I got to buy this album. It was a great Latin jazz thing from the early 70s, I want to say. So now this week, I'm doing this one specifically about Rudy Van Gelder, who passed away yesterday, for a couple reasons. Several reasons, actually. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was going to do a video about Rudy Van Gelder. I didn't hear that he was ill. I knew he was old. I first learned of Rudy Van Gelder in the late 70s when I got into jazz. And I always read the liner notes of the albums. And I kept on reading these albums that were recorded in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, not far from where I live. And as I started buying more older jazz, I was discovering a lot of albums recorded in a different Van Gelder studio earlier, in the early 50s, in Hackensack, right next to where I live, blocks away from where I live. So it got me curious because it seems like literally every East Coast jazz artist, not just in the New York, New Jersey area, but it seems like every East Coast jazz artist had recorded a ton of albums at this Van Gelder studio, either the one in Hackensack or the one in Englewood Cliffs. So over the years, I read a lot about the history of it. Only recently did I find out some personal things about Rudy Van Gelder, who was, I guess, an amateur radio fanatic, is how he got into electronics and recording and music. In my eyes, I tend to see Rudy Van Gelder as like an earlier version of Manfred Eicher of ECM Records. Now, Manfred Eicher is a record producer, not an engineer, with a vision, with his own record label. Rudy Van Gelder is more of an engineer, but because of the sound that he got on his records and the way that he set up his studio, musicians loved to record there, so he was almost like a producer. Like he had kind of set the stage for them to be relaxed. And there's some artists like Wes Montgomery and Ron Carter over the years recorded most of their studio albums actually in his studio. I was reading the history about, he was an optometrist actually, by trade initially, that worked in Teaneck, New Jersey, another town right next to where I used to live. And oddly enough, Teaneck, New Jersey was the town that Milt Jackson of the Modern Jazz Quartet chose to live in the last 20 or 30 years of his life until he passed away. Very same town. Very small town with a main street going through it called Cedar Lane. And Rudy Van Gelder was an optometrist during the day, but he already had this interest in amateur radio and electronics and recording music, and actually came up and devised his own recording systems and built his own studio as a very young man. And his parents, I don't know if they had money or what exactly their scenario was, but in the mid-1940s, had a house built in Hackensack, New Jersey. I don't know if they rebuilt a house that they previously lived in, or whether they just bought this plot of land and built a new house in there. But in the mid '40s, when they built this new house that Rudy lived in with his parents, he was in his early 20s then. They built into the house, which was a very modern looking for the time. It was a kind of this hip square. If you go on the internet, there's actually pictures of it. It's been torn down since. This very modern kind of hip square. It was a square house, but it was very modern looking for the time, for the 1940s. And when the house was built, they had a recording studio built into it because Rudy Van Gelder had already got his interest in recording music and had already apparently started recording music. Now, I'd read that initially he started recording jazz music, which music that he was interested in, and artists that he was interested in his parents' living room. So apparently in Hackensack, he started recording these people in his living room. When they decided to have this house built or rebuilt, their old house, they built a professional recording studio into the house. So now it was a real recording studio. And they used that studio to record a lot of classic albums. Miles Davis, one of the few times Miles Davis recorded with Thelonious Monk was on 1954, this very famous Christmas Eve session. Came out on a couple albums. One of them was called Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants. One of the few times that Miles recorded with Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk recorded solo albums there. Early Miles, my favorite period of Miles, recorded in Van Gelder's studio a great deal. All his classic albums with John Coltrane were recorded there. The stuff that came out of there. Even Antonio Carlos Jobim. Now, I know the American record labels were financing in the late 60s, early 70s Antonio Carlos Jobim's albums, but I thought that they had all been recorded in Brazil. But one of my favorite Antonio Carlos Jobim albums, I think from about '69, called Tide, was actually recorded right there in Van Gelder's studio. So the original studio that was built in Hackensack, oddly enough, was, I only found this out in recent weeks, was actually only literally on the same block as my family doctor growing up. So from the time I was a little kid, we didn't have pediatricians back then. Everybody went to the same doctor in my family. And from the time I was born, I went to this family doctor right up until, I don't know, the early 1980s maybe. And I didn't know. His house was literally on the same block. It could have been even next door to the original Rudy Van Gelder's parents' house where his studio was built in. Now, in 1959, Van Gelder moved a few towns away and had a studio built in a town called Englewood Cliffs, which is, I don't know, maybe about 10 or 12 miles away from the Hackensack studio. And once that studio was built, he recorded all the albums there, even though his parents' house still stood with the original recording studio in it, in Hackensack, New Jersey. And so when I was a little kid going to doctor's appointments, I was passing right by this house without even knowing it. This famous house that would have housed all these sessions that if I were a little older, I would have been dying to see. But in 1959, he had this very hip studio built in Englewood Cliffs, built from the ground up, strictly a recording studio. And it looked like a Swiss chalet. And again, very close to where I live. An odd coincidence is my sister for 19 years worked at a big corporate company, which is housed literally across the street from the Van Gelder Studios, which still stands and is still operational today in Englewood Cliffs. My sister never knew there was a recording studio there. I got the address one time, and after buying so many albums and being so infatuated with this man and all the musicians that were still actively recording in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even now, I decided on one Saturday to go and try to find this studio. I'm like, how hard could it be? I have the address. And my sister had no idea where it was, even though it was literally across the street from where she lived. Well, I see when I got there, I kind of drove, I'm reading the addresses of the buildings in front of it, there's a bunch of, woodsy, a little woodsy area that I drove by, and then another bunch of buildings and businesses there after this woodsy area. And all I noticed is, well, the number I'm looking for is someplace between where these businesses are here, this woodsy area, and where these businesses are here. The number of the studio was right here in the middle somewhere, but all I see is woods. So I got adventurous, and I did a U-turn, drove back down around, and discovered, tucked away in all these trees, you can't see what's past the trees. I see this little road, 1 car wide. I took a chance. I drove down there into this road, only 1 car wide. You couldn't turn around until you got to the studio. And there I see this thing, this little thing that looks like a very hip 2-story wood Swiss chalet. Very hip. I'm like, that's got to be it. That's got to be it. There was a couple cars outside there. There's probably recording going on inside. I very quickly did a U-turn and hightailed it out of there. There's no security or anything. But it was incredible. It's because that's such a developed and built-up area, how they tucked the studio away. So even in the fall and winter, when there's no leaves on the trees, there's enough of those thin little trees, hundreds of them, that are set, toward the front of the property, so that you can't see this Swiss chalet studio that's right there. It's maybe a few hundred feet in from the road. But as the one and only time that I went there, but I've never forgotten it. I've been infatuated with it before and since. And when I got into jazz, in the late 70s, there wasn't any internet or anything like that. And I kept on reading Rudy Van Gelder's name, and I'm seeing sessions from the early 50s and things like that. And I'm like, gee, I wonder if this guy's even still alive. I mean, the name of the studio isn't going to change just because he passes away. To me, I thought in the late 1970s and early 80s, when I was really getting into jazz, I was like, gee, he's still around. He must be really old. Well, it turns out he wasn't really old back then. He had just started recording very young, and getting the producer's credit very young. And a good friend of mine in high school, his mom knew somebody who probably knew somebody who knew Rudy Van Gelder and said a little bit about him. He was kind of an eccentric guy, which was par for the course, right? Now, I compared him to Manfred Eicher. Manfred Eicher is a producer with a vision and not an engineer really so much. Rudy Van Gelder was more of an engineer and never referred to himself as a producer. But the amount of musicians that worked with him time after time after time, there must have been a reason behind it. They were comfortable in his studio. Literally everybody that played in New York jazz recorded albums there, in his studio. And some people, like Wes Montgomery, didn't even live in the area. Wes Montgomery's from Indianapolis. And yet so many of Wes's later studio albums, almost all of them, were actually recorded there, which is weird because Wes would have had to have traveled to record here in New Jersey in those. And my friend sent me an email with an attached internet article saying Rudy Van Gelder had passed away yesterday at the age of 91. Actually, he's less than a year older than my dad. I knew he was still alive because in recent years he'd been remastering and re-releasing a lot of the old sessions. So he lived a good long life. Today I wanted to, well, here's another coincidence. Here I am growing up and I'm going to this doctor's office in Hackensack, not knowing that the doctor's office is a few houses away from where these classic records were recorded. And then my sister's working in Englewood Cliffs for 19 years, starting in the late 70s through the 80s, right across the street from the new Van Gelder studio, which was in operation from 1959 till currently. And just a lot of coincidences with the Van Gelder thing. And now in my new job, when I'm out there on the road driving around, now I knew Rudy Van Gelder was still active in his studio, so I knew he lived somewhere in the area. I didn't know where. In the context of my new job, I'm driving around in the town right next to where I live now, a town called Ramsey, and I came across a street called Van Gelder Court. and I'm like, this is not a coincidence. This has got to be the street that he lives on. And I have not yet gone down the street, but today I knew, for Rudy, I was going to do this. I was going to do this video talking about him. Any hardcore mainstream jazz fans, I think you're going to, certainly DC members, because we're all nuts and we read and absorb all the liner notes of these albums. I think are going to, be familiar with Rudy and his name. Maybe not be aware of the fact that he started recording, I guess, like in the early to mid 40s and continued on till currently. I made a special trip out today, once again, to this town next to mine. It's 10-15 minutes away. I wanted, for this video, which I figured I was going to record, I wanted to get a picture of the Van Gelder street sign. I don't know how well it's going to come out on the thumbnail. The funny thing is I had to make 2 attempts to get there. I didn't in the course of my work, I had discovered this Van Gelder court, but I didn't know how to get there from home. Thankfully, I have a GPS. I drove down there, and you have to go down one specific street to get to this Van Gelder court. And wouldn't you know, today at about noontime, when I just wanted to get a picture of the street sign, when I got down there, the street was closed off because public service was doing something with electric lines or sewer or something like that. So I went to my sister's house after that to do my laundry, and on the way home, about 5 hours later, I decided to go that way again, which is kind of out of my way. This time public service is gone, and I managed to get the photo of the street sign. I don't, now that I look at it, I don't think on a thumbnail it's really going to come out and you're going to see it, but hey, it's there anyway. And there was mostly jazz recorded there. If you go on Wikipedia, you can read about Rudy Van Gelder by typing in Rudy Van Gelder's name. But possibly more interesting than that is if you type in Van Gelder Studio or Studios, probably Van Gelder Studio, what comes up in the course of that Wikipedia article is a listing of all the albums recorded there. It's a combination of both the studios, the original Hackensack studio up to 1959, and the Englewood Cliff studio from 59 onwards. And that particular listing only goes up to 2011, but you can see all the classic albums recorded there. Now I have many albums and even more CDs of recordings made in Van Gelder Studios, and I decided to pull out a bunch of them. Specifically the albums, simply because they show up better on camera than tiny CD booklets. But this is not even a representative sampling of what was recorded there. It's simply the stuff that I actually had sitting here on my bedroom floor, flipping through it and verifying that they were recorded in Van Gelder Studio. Oh my God, that's heavy. So here's Wes Montgomery, one of my favorites. Bumpin', one of his highly arranged albums, arranged by Don Sebesky, my favorite arranger who's still around. This was one of many late period, like mid to late 60s, because Wes died in 68, period Wes Montgomery albums, recorded at Van Gelder Studios in Englewood Cliffs. Like I said, these are just a bunch that I had sitting on the floor that are personal favorite albums of mine, Jimmy Smith and Wes Montgomery. They made 2 albums. I believe both of them were recorded as a duo, with supporting musicians. I believe both of them were recorded there. And these, when I saw the Van Gelder Studio, this little Swiss chalet thing, it didn't look that big to me. But they had, full string sections and orchestras in there, so they must have been bigger. Here's an album that everybody hates, probably, because it comes close to easy listening jazz, but it's one of my first ever jazz albums, Ron Carter, A Song for You, titled after the Leon Russell composition, A Song for You, which I particularly love. It's one of those albums I love that I think is hated by just about everybody. And someday I'm going to do a video, I think, on that, albums that pretty much everybody hates that I love. I think people don't like them because there's strings on here and it's a little syrupy at times. But, and they do the Leon Russell song, A Song for You. But they also do, a version of Someday My Prince Would Come, this is a good album that I waited for many many years to get re-released on CD. And when they re-released it on CD, they released two albums on one disc, and this was the second one which is playing in the background. The Song for You and Parfait, both recorded in the late 70s. Well, this one was recorded in 1980. The prior one was, I think, 78. Both recorded Rudy Van Gelder Studios in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Can you see that there? It's a little blurry. It's very blurry. Okay, let me try to focus. There we go. September 29, Rudy Van Gelder Studios, blah, 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 blah. Ron Carter. Ron loved to, gotta put the autofocus back on. Ron's a New Yorker anyway, so he recorded a lot of albums. Still does, actually. I think he started recording albums in the early 70s. I verified albums from the early 70s Ron Carter did as leader that recorded at Van Gelder Studios, and he was doing at least an album a year as a leader. 70s, 80s, 90s, I've got albums up in the 2000s, all that recorded there. This is a reissue of an album called Miles Davis Collector's Items, but the original cover was different, but that too was recorded at Van Gelder Studios. Oh, the big guy. Most of John Coltrane's classic later period recordings were recorded there. Here's a particular favorite of mine. Interstellar Space. I believe Interstellar Space was the last studio recording sessions the sessions that made up this album were the last, I believe, studio sessions ever recorded by John Coltrane before his death. I think there were some live performances that were released on album after this. This particularly interested me because it's a duet album. Just John Coltrane and drummer Rashid Ali. Rashid Ali only passed away a few years ago, too. Pretty wild, free jazz stuff. Not mellow listening. Pretty much the free jazz mode that John was in at the time. It's just John on saxophone and Rashid Ali on drums. The CD reissue has some bonus tracks on here as well. But John Coltrane's later classic period stuff, even before his free jazz period, were also recorded at Van Gelder Studios. Morera, however you pronounce it. This is a reissue of an album called Free. When they reissued it in 1982, they titled it Return to Forever, thinking it would probably sell a few more copies. With the association of Return to Forever, Airdo was an original member on it. Chick Corea, Stanley Clarke play on here, as well as Joe Farrell, who's also an original member of Return to Forever from 1972. This is probably, I haven't heard all of Airdo's, but this is one of my favorites of the ones that I've heard. Classic Miles. All of the Miles Davis quintet sessions that released on the Prestige label. Relaxing with the Miles Davis Quartet, Working with the Miles Davis Quartet, Smoking with the Miles Davis, all those albums that had John Coltrane, Red Garland on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, Paul Chambers on bass, all of those, and this one, which is predates those, recorded at Van Gelder Studios. And I went through this period just before the CD era of really digging George Benson's pre-Breezen stuff. Turns out they were all these albums were recorded in Van Gelder Studios, and Airdo, oddly enough, shows up on this one, as well as Herbie Hancock, who recorded there quite a bit himself. This is from '71. Another George Benson one recorded there. Well, George Benson's a New Jersey guy anyway. This one's from May '74. Look how young George is there. May 1974, Creed Taylor album. Can you see the Van Gelder Studios? Recorded May 1974. George doing a version of Take 5 on the Cure. Another George Benson one, Cast Your Fate to the Wind, which was a reissue of an album called Good King Bad, from another Creed Taylor production, 1975. Like I said, this is by no means definitive. Here's a real famous Eric Dolphy out to lunch. Yeah. Bobby Hutcherson. tying in Bobby Hutcherson with Rudy Van Gelder, both passed away about a week, you know, within each other. Tony Williams. Elvin Jones recorded there a bunch of times, and over the years. Here's an album I want to get. I got to get this on CD because I'm such a fan of Charlie Mariano in particular. Richard Davis on here. He was on the last album as well. Another late period Elvin Jones with Dave Liebman. I like this album a lot. I have to get this on CD. I recorded February 10, 1982, Van Gelder Studios, Englewood Cliffs. I remember really liking this album. I haven't spun this in many years. Kenny Kirkland on piano, the late Kenny Kirkland, George Mraz on bass, Dave Liebman on saxophone, and Elvin Jones on drums. That's a good album. Even recorded some slick smooth jazz there. This entire album was not recorded there, but a chunk of this album, several tracks, was Eric Gale album. And I went through a period too in the early 80s of really digging Eric Gale's. Very, what would now be called smooth jazz, but didn't even have a name then. And this is from the early 1980. Part of this was recorded there. Miles Davis, Volume 1 and 2, before he even had the classic quartet. But you can see he's playing with some big names there. J.J. Johnson, Jackie McLean, Art Blakey, Kenny Clark. Recorded at Van Gelder Studios. This was the original Van Gelder Studios. I believe this would have been the Hackensack Studios. This isn't even scratching the surface. I was surprised to find Yusef Lateef had recorded there as well. I showed this out. This is a two-for release of a couple different early albums. Recorded in Hackensack, New Jersey, October 9th and 10th, 1957. All of the tracks on here. These were released on these selections were recorded all in 2 days, but released on 3 different. They might have been like 10-inch LPs or something like that. Simply called Yusef Lateef Gong. I gotta find out what these are. I'm sure the title is different now. I'm sure these have been re-released on CD. This is more mainstream, less world music, Yusef Lateef stuff, but really nice. Wilbur Hardin on flugelhorn, Hugh Lawson on piano and ocarina, Ernie Farrow on bass, and Oliver Jackson on drums, and Yusef Lateef on tenor sax, flute, and tambourine. Savoy Records. Like that cover too. That's just the stuff like I had laying on my floor that was just around, that was recorded at Van Gelder Studios. So I have this connection, this weird connection with Van Gelder, and things keep coming up. And I knew he lived around here, but I didn't know he lived literally in the town next to where I live now. So going back to when I was born in 1959 and in the 60s, he was living in Hackensack, and I lived in a town called South Hackensack, the town right next to it. All these years later, I moved to this town where I'm in now, and the town next to me, once again, Rudy Van Gelder lives in, after I moved. And that's about, 12, 15 miles, 17 miles, something like that, from my old original house. So, you might have to trust me on the thumbnail, but it is a picture of Van Gelder Court street sign that I took today in memory and honor of Rudy Van Gelder, who is, when I think of big deal producers that I would just love, guys that I could sit down and talk to for days and question them, Manfred Eicher and Rudy Van Gelder, that's it, really. So, Rudy Van Gelder, maybe the more traditional, conservative, more mainstream, whatever you want to call it, kind of visionary, but of course from a different, slightly earlier era. And I know all you guys that are, heavily into jazz, that like any mainstream stuff at all, would have seen his name pop up a million times. The record label, specifically Blue Note Records, really loved him and went and seeked him out to do their recordings. So as many recordings as Blue Note could get done in his studio, they did. He was their go-to guy. And, recording for Prestige Records, but he wasn't really affiliated with these labels, but these labels knew and liked his work, sent their musicians there to record, and apparently the musicians loved to record there. So big things up for Rudy, lived to be 91. I'm kind of sad because I have to be honest, all these years, I've been hoping to meet him, somehow run across him, even though I wouldn't know him if I saw him. And I even, now just literally a few weeks ago when I discovered this Van Gelder Court Street that I'm assuming that he lived on, um, was only, in the town next to me. Once again, I started getting those thoughts of, man, I might run across him. I would love to meet him someday. And I still would, but now it's impossible. So, and I wonder, I bet you there's not a single person anywhere in his neighborhood that has any idea of who he is or what he does. Because nobody, well, I would say nobody in this area is into jazz, but, I seriously doubt that anybody in the neighboring towns had any inkling of who he was, what he did, how well known he was amongst this core group of people like me, and people like the VC. So I just, I'm doing this video. Oddly enough, I got a day off work. I wouldn't say it's on schedule. Actually, I have two consecutive days off work. Now, I've worked at this job for 9 months, and this is only the third time in 9 months that I've had 2 consecutive days off. So I actually have tomorrow off. I had today off, and usually I get 1 day a week off, and I have to rush over to my sister's house and do my laundry, and do my food shopping. And cheers, because I have beer here. I'm celebrating I have 2 consecutive days off, because I know it's not going to happen again for a while, possibly until I quit. I'm just celebrating that. I did my laundry today because I'm not rushed, because I'm tomorrow off. I didn't do my food shopping, which normally I would be out there right now food shopping, and it blows my whole day off to do the laundry and the food shopping. I'll do my food shopping tomorrow, and I won't spend the whole day doing it. So I have a little bit of free time to relax tomorrow, and spend some Rudy Van Gelder recorded stuff, whatever. So guys, I hope everybody's doing well. Another video for me. I did not expect to do one so soon, but I just had to give a big thumbs up to Rudy. And like I said, it's sad, but if I only came on here to do videos about the guys who passed away, I would still be able to do a video every 2 weeks, because we just lost Bobby Hutcherson last week. I can't even keep up with them. Okay, guys, thanks for watching. If you did indeed watch, and big things up for Rudy. If you have any Rudy Van Gelder music, or especially music that's a favorite of yours, maybe give it a spin in honor of Rudy Van Gelder. Okay, guys, take care.